everyone. Welcome to Profits Explainer on Microfinance Banks on the verge of crisis. The story made it to the cover, and it's by Ahtasam Ahmad, who has joined us to talk us through the story. So Ahtasam claims that the sector is sitting on a ticking time bomb in the shape of loans at the risk of default, a situation triggered by the pandemic. And, to talk about the story, let's just ask Ahtasam. Ahtasam, run us down the story.
Hi Ariba, hi audience. So basically the idea came to me because I was consulting the sector back when the pandemic hit the industry. और तब the things were quite bleak regarding their capital adequacy and their non-performing loans. So I'll just run you down what happened before the during the pandemic and what's the situation now. So during the pandemic, the industry was quite obviously, like every industry, their recoveries were halted. The reason for it was उनका जो sector है, microfinance sector है, that's primarily for I would say the lowest economic strata of the country. And the pandemic, unfortunately, it was like these people were the most affected by the pandemic. The economic effect of the pandemics was felt by these people the most. As a result of that, their ability to pay back their loans was it decreased massively. And at that time, State Bank, they anticipated that the banks would not be able to recover the loans. Or उस case में there would have been massive defaults, and you know that if there are massive defaults for the bank, it's not good news for the industry. So State Bank stepped in. They introduced a scheme जहाँ पे the borrowers, they could restructure their loans or reschedule their loans. And how that works is that they could defer the payments, the principal payments. They still had to pay the interest, but they deferred the principal payment for an year, 12 months. So that somewhat helped their liquidity. And at that time also the industry, the microfinance industry as a whole, they communicated their concerns to the State Bank, the Pakistan Bankers Association, and back then they were of the view that if they weren't assisted, so the pandemic would result and the resultant NPLs would ultimately erode their capital up to 40 to 45%.
Wow, and 45%.
Exactly.
Do you think the sector could absorb that shock?
They couldn't, and that was the reason they communicated this to the State Bank and the Pakistan Bankers Association, because they wanted some relief, because the sector generally, if I give you a background, the sector is not that profitable, neither it's in a very good condition generally, even before the pandemic. And the reason for that is how this sector is, I'd say, structured. I did another story about the business model of the microfinance sector as a whole and the banks particularly. And in that story, I did explain that the sector technically operates in the three models. One, there are the banks that are backed by the telcos, जिनकी apps हैं Jazz Cash, Easy Paisa, and JuBank की JuPaisa. So these players are in the sector solely for the license. They cannot operate without the banking license. ये अपनी apps operate नहीं कर सकते. Particularly the Jazz Cash and Easy Paisa apps, क्योंकि उनकी base इतनी बड़ी है, so the microfinance banks for them are secondary. वो license के एक vehicle है. The interest is digital finance. Then there are NGO-backed banks, the NRSP Bank and the Kasha Foundation and Aga Khan also have their interest in the sector. It's an extension of their vision of poverty alleviation. And technically they are NGO-backed banks, so they are not looking at profitability. And the third one is the most interesting game, that's the commercial banks. So commercial banks are operating like HBL Microfinance Bank, they are operating microfinance banks. The reason for that, I've talked to a few industry insiders, and the only reason they could think of was that that's FOMO, because they think that they'll be losing out on a massive MSME sector, like the micro, small and medium enterprises, and they would be losing out on that, or out of FOMO they have invested in the sector, and that's not like nearly, it's not even what they have expected. Utni profitability bhi nahi hai in banks ki.
So Ahtasam, as the headline suggests, and for viewers that haven't read the story, it says the microfinance banks are on verge of crisis. How impending is the crisis? How soon do you think it can hit, if not mitigated? And what steps have been taken to sort of push back the crisis or to fix it?
Okay, so I'll start from what happened after the pandemic. Like, we know that the loans were restructured, a substantial amount of loans were restructured. But in 2021, the period for the 12-month extension for most of those loans, it ended. So naturally, those loans should have been recovered. Out of the restructured portfolio, majority of the loans, for the major banks, majority of the loans, with the exception of, I'd say, Khoshali Bank, are still pending. And UBank, a very exceptional, more than 90% of the restructured loans are still pending for recovery.
90%?
90%, exactly. They restructured around 8 billion loans, and still the figure is the same, 8 billion. And I'm talking about the year in 2021, December 2021. So, and then the HBL Microfinance Bank, they still have 50% of the restructured loans on their books. And the exception is Khoshali, but Khoshali was the amongst the industry, they restructured unki book value of restructuring was the highest, 35 billion. So out of that, they had recovered around 83%, but they still have a significant amount. If we
the restructuring back then helped them right now.
It did. It was the only way out. It's like I mentioned a piece of Oxford research. I'm not sure if that's the name, but I did add that into my story. And at that time, they researched a sample of borrowers, and 70% of the borrowers during the pandemic were not in the position to pay back their loans. So
okay, makes sense.
So the other thing, if I would say the State Bank wouldn't have bailed them out, so the banks would have defaulted, or the defaults would have been massive. And how massive? You can see what happened to Telenor Microfinance Bank. They incurred, they were I would say that they were unfortunate, they were subjected to a fraud, but again their internal controls, and it's true with most of these microfinance banks, their internal controls are not that strong because of the nature of operations. They engage a very risky, I'd say, they engage in a highly risky credit class.
Building on this risk thing, people that approach microfinance banks for loans essentially see that, so when they approach these microfinance for loans, essentially what they see is that the interest rates are usually higher because they're riskier entities to lend to. But despite that, these microfinance banks find their business operating structure to be very flimsy. So what is your take on that?
So the interest rates are understandably higher. There are two reasons for that. Firstly, they account for the risk. Secondly, so there is a study from the Pakistan Microfinance Network. It states that to disperse an average loan, it takes around 20% in just the cost. So if the markup is around 35% to 40%.
The cost of giving out these loans based on the research done, the grant work done, that is also significantly higher than normal loans?
Yeah. And the reason for that is that they are operating in a sector where the ticket size is low, around 1 to 100, 200 and 150K. तो जब आप 1 से 1.5 लाख की लोन्स दे रहे हो ना, तो यू हैव टू बिल्ड टू दैट, मतलब जो आपके बिलियंस की बुक है, टू बिल्ड दैट यू हैव टू एंगेज विद मोर बोरोवर्स. एंड द अदर थिंग इज वहाँ पे ऑटोमेशन, स्ट्रीमलाइनिंग थिंग्स, उसका स्कोप इतना नहीं है. यू हैव टू लिटरली विजिट फील्ड्स, और आपने फील्ड विजिट्स और ऑपरेशनल कॉस्ट इनकी बहुत ज़्यादा है.
Yeah, so to end this video, if we were to talk about the future, what do you see? How bleak is it? Is there hope? What would we see? Because
So,
microfinance is important for the MSMEs.
so currently the State Bank has again, like for the year end 31st December 2021, they have again allowed the banks a relaxation on their categorization of NPLs. So they have extended the categories for around 30 to 60 days for every class. So again, they have like allowed the banks some room to like manage their losses. Other than that, there are I mentioned the NIT investment fund that can be like source to bail them out. And for now, they might be able to be like State Bank might be able to bail them out, but for the long run, they need to really reconsider that is it a feasible business model to run. The NGOs might run it because they have the money. They are not in it for the profit, but the other two, the telcos too will leave this as soon as the digital banking thing goes. मतलब उनका वो सॉर्ट हो जाए, they will leave this. उनका they have no incentive माइक्रो फाइनेंस बैंक चलाने का. उनके पास वो एसेट स्किल्स भी नहीं है. द ओनली माइक्रो फाइनेंस बैंक दैट इज रिलेटिवली परफॉर्मिंग बेटर इज मोबलिंग माइक्रो फाइनेंस बैंक, एंड दैट ऑल्सो ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ जास कैश डिपॉजिट्स. उसमें उनका कोई कमाल नहीं है. तो एग्जैक्टली तो टेलकोस के लिए इट्स नॉट, मतलब उनका ये बिजनेस भी नहीं है. And from sources I know for a fact that telcos are
Makes sense. But this was really insightful. And based on this discussion, I strongly encourage all of you to go out, read this story by Ahtasam, Microfinance Banks on the Verge of Crisis, and just go through what the industry is about, what's happening right now. And I strongly suggest everyone to read it. Thank you, Ahtasam, for writing such a nice piece, and thank you for joining us for this video.